Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Justine Hausheer is a science writer for the Nature Conservancy. Her stories have won awards from the Outdoor Writers Association of America and have been featured in the Best Australian Science Writing Anthology. Justine holds degrees from New York and Princeton universities. She now lives on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. Today I'm talking to Justine Hausheer about her new book, The Vanishing Wild, Australian Wildlife and the Fight Against Extinction. Justine Hausheer, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Australia is your adoptive country. You settled in and got to know our wildlife. What struck you then about the environment and the wildlife? And what changes have you noticed since then?
Yeah, well, as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in the United States, but I have always had a fascination with Australian wildlife. I kind of grew up in the peak of the crocodile hunter, Steve Irwin craze in the US. So that's what I was watching on TV as a little girl. And so I've always been interested in Australia and its species here. And then I was lucky enough to move here 10 years ago. I think one of the things I first noticed, having worked in conservation for nearly 20 years, that when I was growing up in the US, you had species like panthers and manatees. Like I grew up in Florida that, you knew about endangered species, as we call them there, threatened species. But you also had a lot of stories of recovery. I also had alligators, bald eagles in my backyard, left, right, and center. Decades ago, those species nearly went extinct, and they were really brought back and recovered to the point that they're quite common. And I just didn't see that quite as much in Australia, or it wasn't quite as obvious. We have things like humpback whales that have had a remarkable recovery, but in that case, all we really had to do was stop shooting them. And so that sort of got me wondering, what is the sort of status of threatened wildlife in Australia? What are some of the problems they face here? How is that different to other parts of the world, different to what I was used to in the US? Because in many ways, the countries are sort of comparable, similar size, wealthy, similar amount of threatened species. But I was just sort of really curious in that comparison, and that started me down the road of writing this book about threatened species in Australia.
Swift parrots are a species that are a magnet for you, but among the thousands of bird species, why the swift parrot?
The swift parrot is highly, highly endangered, and it's not something that you can go and see easily. They are sort of eruptive and nomadic. They're migratory, and then when they are up, sort of on the mainland, they're sort of following the blossoming eucalyptus. So it's not something that's easy to go and see. And it was about a little bit, not quite this time last year, we got a rare bird alert that came up. I'm a birder, and so I subscribe to these sort of things like a nerd, that there were swift parrots that had showed up in Toowoomba, of all places, which is just about 3 hours down the road from me on the Sunshine Coast. And so I absolutely raced out to go and see them. And I felt it was a lot of conflicting emotions as I'm sitting here on this long drive, because there's a little bit of a guilt that comes with, oh, just am I being a bit of a twitcher, rushing to just tick this bird off the list? And am I really appreciating it for what it is, as opposed to just because it's rare? But nothing compares to the joy for a birder of seeing any bird, let alone a rare species. And there was a bit of sadness tinged in that as well, because I have to wonder, they're not quite common in Southeast Queensland. This was a bit of a special experience to get them this far north. Am I going to see this bird again with such a critically endangered bird? And that's the same feeling I have anytime I am lucky enough to see a threatened species. Am I going to see this again? There's always that little bit of concern in the back of one's mind.
Let's talk about another critically endangered species, the night parrot. It's elusive, critically endangered. It's attained a kind of mythical status. It's been in the news lately because of a discovery of a previously unknown population. But I want to know how it achieved this mythical status, and what did it take to discover a previously unknown population? Is that just dumb luck or long hours and hard work?
Look, a bit of both when it comes to night parrot populations. So this bird is something that has been such a myth that even I was aware of it long before I lived in Australia. It's one of those species that we think again, historical records are a bit patchy, but we think it was once reasonably common in the arid interior. And like a lot of our small mammals, it pretty much disappeared along the track of the introduction of feral predators moving into areas, along with the sort of grazing and altered fire regimes as well. And so by the 1930s, naturalists were writing that the bird is probably doomed. Now, the common narrative is that everyone thought the species was extinct, but that's not quite true. Ecologists recognized that the bird was probably still out there, and there were all these kind of sightings trickling in from graziers and all these people who spend time out in the desert. They think they saw one. And I think that really contributed to the myth, was that it didn't completely fall off the radar, but there were just these little hints that perhaps it was out there somewhere. And then you had a couple of carcasses turn up in the 1990s. And then in 2006, people found a desiccated carcass just by pure dumb luck. And they went, oh my gosh, okay, it is still out there. But we didn't know where. And then the bird was rediscovered officially in 2013, living real birds in 2013 by a naturalist. Sean Dooley over at BirdLife, he described it as the bird watching equivalent of finding Elvis flipping burgers in an Outback Roadhouse. It was astounding. And so that was, a naturalist did manage to find them. Since then, all of the populations since that first one have been discovered using small acoustic recorders. So this is what the research I was out participating in out in far Western Queensland. And it's also how this more recent population was discovered in Western Queensland by that same research group. Is using these tiny little audio recorders you can put out in the desert, leave that there for 6 months. And because night parrots call very regularly at dawn and dusk, you can then take all of hours and hours of audio data, run it through computers, or listen to it if you really are a glutton for punishment, and know whether or not a night parrot is in that particular location at that time. And so what the scientists that I've been working with at the University of Queensland, and they work for Bush Heritage now, they've taken that technology and handed it over to Indigenous rangers. And so out in Western Australia, they have found dozens and dozens of populations of night parrots by using their knowledge of country, that traditional knowledge, to kind of hone in amongst this vast landscape. Where should we search? And they've got, working with the Indigenous Desert Alliance, a number of different ranger teams. They've got about a 50% success rate of putting these out. Do they find a night parrot population? So the vast majority of populations and of physical night parrots that we know of are out in far Western Australia. Scientists have still been searching in Western Queensland, likely habitat, and they have, yes, managed to find one additional population, but the majority are far out west. This mythic bird of the desert was, in fact, still out there, tantalizing birdwatchers still, because it's in such a remote and inaccessible place, and people rarely get to see or hear them.
Let's talk a little more about invasive species. They're recognised as a huge threat to our wildlife, but it's sometimes a contentious area. While the cane toad doesn't have very many friends, species like horses, foxes, and feral cats can divide communities. Is there a balance to be achieved, or is complete elimination the only way forward?
I think it matters as to what your priorities are. If your priorities are to protect native wildlife, complete elimination is what we need. Whether or not that's achievable is another question. I personally, I'm not entirely sure we will ever get there, certainly not with the technologies that we have on our plate at the moment. But that's a large area of research, any numbers of conservation scientists trying to figure out how do we not just control cats or foxes in a small area. We've got a lot of tools for that, but how do we control them at scale over larger landscapes? And baiting can work reasonably well for foxes. They've had a lot of success in the Flinders Ranges of being able to do large scale area baiting to help reintroduce populations of brush-tailed possum and quail there. But again, that is still a relatively small geographic area compared to all of Australia. Cats have now colonized more than 99% of the continent. So that is still a massive conservation challenge, and it's one that is going to continue to be a problem, I think, for years to come.
And by the way, what are the cane toad Olympics?
So that's a term I made up. I don't know how the researchers feel about it, but it certainly is an apt description. So with cane toads, as every Australian knows, they have moved across the country over the decades, coming across the Northern Territory and Western Australia. in more recent years. And it's just been this absolute wave. And there have been various incredibly innovative attempts to try and stop them along that route. And scientists have learned quite a lot how we haven't really been able to stop them. We've learned a lot about how we might protect and buffer species like goanna and quoll as the toads move through so that the populations of those predators don't collapse. But we've never really been able to stop them in their tracks. Scientists are making another attempt. Right now, that toad line is closing in on Broome, but there's this fantastic opportunity, just kind of by virtue of geography, where between Broome and Port Hedland, the desert meets the sea, and it's sort of this natural barrier where there aren't water sources. And now toads need water. They can survive in incredibly arid environments, but they need water. It doesn't take much. A sprinkler head, a dripping air conditioning unit, a dam, all of those things will keep toads alive through the dry season. And then once the landscape is saturated in the wet, they can keep moving. And so ecologists sort of looked and realized we had this opportunity in this section of country where the only real water sources are man-made. They are farm dams. They're a couple of pivot irrigators, solar power bores that just sort of pump and make a giant puddle. And so what if we can modify those to clean up the water so that there's no water around in the dry season? If we can cut off access to dry season water, those toads are doomed. They won't be able to get through. Now, the reason we're trying to stop them is because if they get through this section of coast called the Toad Containment Zone, they can get into the Pilbara. And the Pilbara is sort of the last bastion for a lot of these species that have declined elsewhere in the north because of toads. And it's also home to, dozens of endemic species that live just there in the Pilbara. So it would be an absolutely massive tragedy if toads were able to get in. And so the Olympics were a set of experiments that scientists were running. They were running them up outside of Darwin to try to test the methods that they're going to use to keep toads out of certain types of infrastructure. A lot of it's plumbing, right? We just get bore taps that turn off once the dam is full instead of spilling over. But there's some pivot irrigators we're going to need to fence off. So we were running around, grabbing toads at night, shoving them into pillowcases. And then the next night we would tie little numbers onto them, weigh, measure, get all of our data. And we put them through a series of experiments. How high can the toads jump? How high do we need to make any sort of fences? We're going to try to make them out of mesh. Well, can the toads squeeze through? What size does the mesh need to be? And in this case, we knew about how high they could jump, about 50 centimeters. We were looking to see if they could squeeze through this mesh. But what we didn't really anticipate was that they would kind of pull this jump, cling, climb maneuver where they would jump and they wouldn't be able to get over it, but then they'd cling on and they were actually climbing up the mesh. And so within about 5 minutes, we went, uh-oh. Okay, we're going to need to make these fences out of something solid so that they can't actually climb up over them. And this was a shock. These researchers, some of them have been working on toads for 20 years, and they went, oh my gosh, this is still something we didn't anticipate. So through the Olympics and this series of experiments, they're testing out those infrastructure modifications, and they're going to be starting work on the ground hopefully soon because the toads are slated to arrive to get into that zone. I think it's about Christmas of next year, I believe. So a bit of a race against time, but it's incredibly exciting. And if it works, it will be really, really fantastic and will save quite a number of species from severe decline and threat in the Pilbara.
We know that climate change is affecting habitat, but what kind of human interventions are possible? And should we be optimistic about the prospects of those interventions? Here I'm thinking of the mountain pygmy possum. I've never actually seen one in the wild, despite having spent a lot of time in Australia's high country. What are my chances of seeing one, and what are the prospects for the pygmy possum?
Well, your chances of seeing one are very, very low unless you find the right boulder field and overturn every single rock in it. They are very, very small and they live very, very far down in these boulder piles that can sometimes be quite deep. So the only reason I was lucky enough to see them was I actually joined some ecologists with the New South Wales government to do sort of a regular monitoring survey in Kosciuszko National Park. And yeah, look, climate change for all species, both mountain pygmy possums are a great example, but for really any threatened species, you often see it listed as sort of like a single entity, like another item on the laundry list of all the problems a species is facing. And I think the reality that was really driven home to me as I was writing this book was that It's a tangled mess of multiple threats. It's direct and indirect that are sort of overlapping and interacting with one another. So climate change can be a threat in and of itself, but it also can sort of magnify or exacerbate existing threats. And it can also undermine some of the conservation efforts that we've been doing to address other threats. So, with the mountain pygmy possum, they're already kind of a species that's a little bit just vulnerable for a number of reasons. They've got a small population size, a very limited range, a very specific diet. All of those things make them a bit more vulnerable. But back when it was first rediscovered in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when they were doing kind of the foundational science, the biggest threat was habitat loss from the development of ski fields. And now that's not even on the radar anymore. Climate change is disrupting them in a number of ways. You've got reduced snowpack, which disrupts their ability to hibernate. It jeopardizes access to fresh water, impacts alpine plants, which they do eat some alpine plants, makes it easier for cats and foxes to get up and get into them. And then you have completely off the mountaintop, increasingly more severe and more frequent droughts, which are devastating bogong moth populations, which is their primary food resource. And that's what caused the bogong moths to collapse. And so that was something, climate change was impacting something thousands of kilometers away that still affected the possums. And then, of course, in recent years, we've had catastrophic bushfires go through their habitat as well, burning habitats that should not be burning. So it's this sort of tangled mess, and you can't just say climate change is a threat because climate change touches all of the existing threats and adds a lot of new ones. So I think what this tells us is often the fate of some species is going to depend on our ability to anticipate how climate change will magnify the threats they might already face. And it's also going to depend on our ability to respond quickly to sort of disasters like a bushfire or a collapse of a food resource, things like that.
I didn't know there was such a thing as a pygmy blue-tongue lizard.
Yes, two pygmies.
Two. Do smaller species face the greater challenges, or are all species equal in that respect?
I don't really think it has much to do with size per se. I think it's more about people just across the world are inherently sort of biased in what animals they are interested in. It's usually the charismatic megafauna, things that are big and fluffy, like mammals, or if it's, let's say it's not a mammal or a bird, but if you looked at reptiles, people are going to be more interested in something like a sea turtle or even a big parenti than they might be a tiny little skink that is as recognizable or they don't know the name of. And then, of course, you have poor insects and plants all the way down at the bottom of the list. How often do you hear something in the news about a threatened plant? It's not very often. And yet, of the 2,000 species in Australia that are listed as threatened under federal legislation, about 1,400 of them are plants. So, and there should be many more, and there should be many, many more insects on that list. So those sort of biases and just inherently what people are interested in flow into what we pay attention to, what we choose to study, and where the funding goes for conservation. So, the pygmy blue-tongue lizard, it is a tiny little lizard, but in a way it is still benefits from that because it's cute, it's weird, it's a little miniature blue tongue, and that makes it a bit interesting and unusual.
The platypus, widely acknowledged as one of the strangest animals on the planet, rare, elusive, and endangered, but I was surprised to read that they might be living in the industrial heartland of South Brisbane. How was that possible?
Well, they were always here, and so it's a matter of they've managed to hold on through all of the development that's happened in Southeast Queensland and in Brisbane as well. So the platypus always should have been here. It's just a matter of whether they are still here and whether they are able to still persist in urban landscapes. And there are quite a number of platypus in Melbourne as well. And these animals have a lot going for them. This is not ideal habitat, but in some cases they have managed to hang on. And so in the chapter of the book where I'm talking about platypus, I was out with researchers who are using eDNA or environmental DNA to try to study platypus in urban environments because they are, they're quite large and they're charismatic, but they're actually a bit cryptic. They're often out at night or at dawn and dusk. Unless you are at the right part of the stream at the right moment, you might not see them. So they're quite hard to study in that sense. And if you want to go trapping for them, which I have done, you're staying up all night waiting in freezing rivers, and it's not very pleasant. So, by using DNA, little particles of DNA that slough off a platypus, it could be little bits of fur or urine or saliva, whatever, what have you, that stays in the water. And so, if scientists go around and sample a number of different creeks, they can run it through some very complicated machines that I don't understand all that well and filter out the bits of DNA from anything that was in that water. And so we can use that to identify not, is a platypus here all the time, but was a platypus here at that moment, within a couple of days of that sampling. And so that makes it much more efficient to kind of survey for them and figure out how they are doing across Brisbane. And so researchers at Wildlife Queensland have been doing this over a number of years to kind of just track where are they, how are they doing, are populations disappearing, are new platypus populations popping up in different creeks, how are things changing over time? And so, I don't have the data from the most recent field season. That should be actually starting quite soon. But they have found that of the 21 waterways in Brisbane that had historical platypus records, like from newspaper reports or things like that, 5 of them had lost their platypus based on negative DNA results, where this year after year the platypus are not showing up on those eDNA samples. And in 2023, when I was out sampling with researchers, platypus were only persisting in 7 of the 30 waterways sampled across Brisbane City at the time. So they are hanging on, but they're not doing that well. And it's really incredible. Platypus can go over land. Something like a kilometer or two in the past, if it's all forest in a natural environment, they quite happily waddle and disperse to new streams, particularly young males looking for their own territory. But there are 2 creeks in Brisbane right now where they're probably only about 800 meters apart, but there are all these housing developments and a major road. They should absolutely be able to repopulate that if there was better connectivity or less development. There's no way in heck a platypus is going to make it across that road at the moment. So once they're lost from a stream, you're not getting that sort of inflow and that movement of other platypus being able to kind of come in and repopulate. And adding on to that sort of habitat fragmentation and loss. In urban environments, you have pollutions from rubbish, nutrients, agricultural nutrients, sort of a bit farther out of the city, sediment buildup, the way the urban environment sort of changes how floodwaters flow. You get all these big rushing water events that can kind of score out river banks and kind of disrupt their food resource. All of that's only going to get worse with climate change. And then on top of that, you have droughts. And platypus, they can survive droughts if they've got refuge pools, like big deep pools that'll hold water. But again, the more we change the environment, the more we change things in urban areas, the fewer of those remain.
We've already waded into the area of new technologies, but I want to talk about another new technology, de-extinction. How is this possible? What are the technological challenges? And what are the ethical considerations around such interventions?
That is a big question. Is it possible? I think it depends on what we mean by de-extinction. It's kind of a broad term that can be used in any number of ways and encompasses different technologies for how one might be doing something. You have a case where the first sort of technical animal that was brought back via de-extinction, we actually had whole frozen cells, and it was called the bucardo. It was a type of European ibex, and they knew where the last animal was. And they had managed to get cell samples from this animal before it died. And so all you had to do, then you just used sort of basic cloning technology. You have the full cell, off you go. That's not all that complicated. It sort of just relies on similar technology to cloning. In the case of the animal that I looked at in the book, which is the thylacine, that's a whole other kettle of fish. In that case, we're trying to use CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology, to go back and kind of rebuild or re-edit the genome or the genomic blueprint of a dunnart, a fat-tailed dunnart, into a thylacine. And so that, both of those things are technically de-extinction, but you can get there through very different technologies. De-extinction is quite controversial, I think, within the conservation space. And a lot of people, even outside of conservation, have different opinions about it, just sort of in general, and then concerns about different specific projects. So the work being done on the thylacine is actually being done in combination with Melbourne University and a biotechnology company in the United States called Colossal Biosciences. And the scientists that I've spoken with, are very confident that the technology that they are developing to be able to bring the thylacine back. We do not have all the technology at this moment, so they're sort of working on let's figure out how do we do this. They're very confident that that is going to have spin-off benefits for still living species, which would be absolutely excellent if that's the case. My concern in this case is that who owns that knowledge? If the technology we need to save species ends up in the hands of a for-profit company, that's a bit of a concern for me. Separate from the specific case of the thylacine, I worry a lot that kind of overblown claims about de-extinction will be weaponized as an excuse to avoid funding conservation. You saw that with the dire wolf was in the news a lot last year, and that's a project by this same company. You had folks in the Trump administration coming out and saying, great, this is going to solve the extinction crisis. We don't need to worry about endangered species anymore because we can bring them back. And that's just absolutely not the case. Even if the thylacine project is wildly successful, we are not going to be able to resurrect things faster than they're going extinct. And we would be better off putting that money towards just keeping them alive in the first place. It's not something you can do at scale for every species, even if you are ignoring kind of the technological challenges and is it actually capable in any extent. So that's a big concern a lot of conservationists have, particularly is this a good use of our money? Other folks on the animal welfare side of things, and I didn't really delve into this in the book because it's covered elsewhere. They have sort of concerns around the any similar concerns you get with any sort of animal experiment where we're using live animals in this experiment. Is that ethical? That sort of thing. I think for me, where I sort of landed is, regardless of what happens with the thylacine, I personally don't think that whatever they create, it's not going to be a thylacine. It might look like a thylacine, it might walk like one, it might smell like one, but it's not a true thylacine. It's our sort of interpretation of a thylacine created on a genomic level, because species are more than just their genome. They are how they interact with the environment. They're how individuals interact with one another. There's no way you can replace that once it's lost.
I was actually recently in Tasmania. It's so remote and so inaccessible. Is a little population of thylacine still out there? Maybe.
My opinion is yes. Everyone has lots of opinions about this. Where I've come to from my conversation with scientists and ecologists is that, the animal that died on September 7th, 1936 at the Beaumaris Zoo was almost certainly not the last thylacine. I think it takes a large amount of arrogance to assume that we killed every last one in the wild and that one in captivity was the last one. The most likely scenario is that there were a few dozen, maybe up to 100, left at that time, scattered around, and then they slowly died out over the ensuing decades. There have been a number of studies trying to predict with computer modeling when that extinction might have happened and correlating that with when, different sightings were. And the number they arrived at was somewhere between the 40s and the 70s, maybe a small chance of it existing into the 80s when there isn't one quite reliable sighting. We don't know. But at some point, yes, they are extinct. And one of the folks I talked to was actually the government scientist. He's retired now, who was called in to investigate all of those sightings over the years. And he said, he pointed out conditions in Tasmania are better than ever for thylacines. You've got wallaby numbers are up. Tassie devil numbers are down because of the tumor disease. Farmers are no longer poisoning Tasmanian devils, which also was harming thylacines as well. So you have less competition for food, more prey. And he said we should have thylacines coming out of our ears, but we don't. And I think that's if you've driven around Tasmania, you've seen that the roadkill is everywhere.
Literally every 100 meters, you would see roadkill.
So not once in all of the ensuing decades have you had any roadkill, anything on a camera trap. Absolutely nothing. We should have them pouring out of our ears, and we don't. Look, I would love to be wrong. But I think, they slowly died out. And yes, honestly, it is theoretically possible they were still around, even one or two into the 80s. But at that point, it's called functionally extinct. If you don't have enough to maintain a healthy population, they're gone.
My final question to you, Justine, is about you and your work. It's taken you into the field. You've followed logging elephants through Myanmar, surveyed for sea cucumbers in Manus, and waded into outback waterholes. What brings you the most concern and the most joy?
I think I always find joy in the science itself. I mean, I spend my holidays out in the bush. I love bird watching and I go looking for mammals at night with flashlights. I love being out in the bush, but I really, really love being out with scientists. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book is because every day in my professional job, my day job, I'm learning about incredible work being done by scientists and land managers and traditional owners. And I wanted to take readers into the field with me. A lot of conservation, particularly in Australia, happens out in these remote areas where people don't get to see it. They don't get to see these species. They don't get to see science in action. And so I wanted to show readers conservation science at its best, the joys of that work, the challenges, the absurdity. You're hurling yourself out of a car to grab cane toads. Trapping Tassie devil sounds like a lot of fun until you realize as a volunteer you're usually just scrubbing poop. So to just the fieldwork is it's fun, it's exciting, it can be frustrating, but so people can appreciate the joys and challenges of the work and also the sort of creativity and dedication of the people who are trying to keep our wildlife from vanishing with often not enough resources and at great personal cost as well. So that's to me, I love being out in the field with scientists and I love seeing this sort of work in action. In terms of what concerns me the most, I think one of the things that was most surprising to me that I learned throughout this book, and the thing that kind of keeps me up at night or makes me the most frustrated really, is that coming into this, I assumed, this is a knowledge problem. We just need to know more and do more and study more to help these species. And so I was really surprised to learn that most of the time, we actually know enough to take action. We know enough that we could get really stuck in and make a big difference at things like reducing threats, restoring habitat, or anything else a particular species might need. We might not know everything, but we know enough. But the outlook for wildlife keeps getting worse and worse because we're not prioritizing nature. We're not committing the funds, and we don't have the right policy protections in place to stop species from continuing to slide down this slope towards extinction. And so that's most concerning for me. It's not a knowledge problem. It's whether or not we are prioritizing this as a society. Australians spend $33 billion a year on their pets. And that's not to say we shouldn't. I spoil my little puppy rotten. But we have the money to do this. And that's such an interesting comparison to me because it shows how much we're willing to spend on the animals we adopt into our families versus wild animals. And conservation is notoriously underfunded. And at the same time, since colonization, 200 years, we've lost 100 about endemic species in Australia. But what's most concerning to me is the rate at which things are going extinct has not slowed down. We're just not doing enough. And we really need to do more. It's not a knowledge problem. It's a money problem. We just need to dedicate the funds. We've got the scientists ready to do the work, and we really know what we need to do.
Justine Hausheer, thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg.
I've been talking to Justine E. Hausheer about her new book, The Vanishing Wild, Australian Wildlife and the Fight Against Extinction. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.